Начинаем наш визит в Канберры. Ну, это не самая, как говорится, лучшая постановка такого действа. Но вот сзади меня вы видите, в общем-то, центр информационный. На въезде из Сиднея в Канберру вы легко увидите. Очень удобный паркинг. И я думаю, что начинать надо с него. Здесь хороший туалет. И здесь есть даже душевая такая прекрасная. То есть вы можете спокойно, совершенно бесплатно прийти, переодеться, принять душ, как говорится, справить весь свой туалет, то есть там почистить зубы и так далее. И выйти абсолютно свежим для того, чтобы покорить Канберру. Это национальная столица Австралии. Итак, добрый путь. Вот в информационном центре вы можете посмотреть и купить какие-то сувенирчики, всякое винцо. Здесь вот информационный центр, как раз вам все расскажут, дадут бесплатно какие-то брошюрки. Вы можете как бы спросить совет. Часы, они знают все, здесь эти добровольцы. Здесь такие экраны, мониторы хорошие. Ну, мне кажется, что цены здесь высоковатые за всякие кепочки. Скажем, кепочка стоит $13, точно такая кепочка стоит, может быть, $3 на рынке, качество то же самое. Рюмочки, не знаю, набор, если по одной рюмочке $7, это что-то дофига. Всякие ложки, думаю, серебряные, может быть и нет. Вот такие сувенирчики. Интересные объемные картинки. Так вот. Ну и теперь, наверное, парламентский дом. Надо будет съездить и посмотреть, что у нас и как. Это здание Национальной библиотеки. Очень такое красивое. Очень хорошие люди. Вот такие вот виды отсюда. Сейчас только что говорили о том, что неплохо бы, чтобы вся Австралия была как Канберра, как Хоксбери. Что-то поднадоели такие, как Гранвилл и Лакемба. Но вот такая вот окружающая замечательная среда, просто шикарнейшая, просто замечательная. Люди, Гриффин, то ли река, то ли озеро. Вот можно паркинги видеть, но, к сожалению, здесь паркинги платные все, $2.50 в час. Это, наверное, немного, но значительно. Фактически в этих местах нет бесплатного паркинга. По крайней мере, так мне было сказано. И пока что я в этом убеждаюсь. Вот она, Национальная библиотека. Это научный центр в Канберре. Вот тоже рекомендую зайти сюда. Такие футуристические какие-то картинки, скульптурки. Непонятно, что это такое. Тоже паркинг. Вот видите, паркинг на 4 часа. Значит, 4 часа, 10 часов, $10. Соответственно, вот такая машинка. И платит $2,5 часа. $2,5 в час. Фактически везде. Вот люди приходят в исследовательский центр, этот научный центр. Вот какая красавица машинка. Самое лучшее, наверное, что тут есть, это мой авто. Да. Вот это центр. Вот вход сюда. Еще одна Toyota, это Клюгер. Вот сюда вот входим и смотрим то, что нам надо. А мы поехали дальше, нам в парламентский дом. Итак, мы находимся рядом с новым парламентом Австралии. Вот это здание. Я думаю, мы сейчас сделаем экскурсию туда. Экскурсия начинается, по-моему, в 11, в час, в 3 дня. И продолжается 45 минут. Экскурсия бесплатная, 2 часа паркинг под землей. И, видимо, вот эти вот паркинги какие-то, да, они бесплатные. Помните, мы говорили о том, что хотели сделать своего рода протест, когда нам не давали, в принципе, сейчас не дают визы. Можно, кстати, на эту тему подумать. Вот мы можем поучаствовать в такой акции. То есть есть даже место, товарищи подвинутся, вместе с ними можно будет побыть. Вот. Вот красивая такая. Такой вид красивый очень. Вот. Классно сделали новую столицу. Ну, то есть, как бы, она уже давно вот, поддерживает австралийское судовождение. Вот мы тоже можем вот так вот встать, какие-то лозунги поставить. Департамент иммиграции. Повестить. И вот красава. Красава. Я думаю, что из этих 45 минут, которые будет экскурсия, наверное, минут 35 надо будет записать. Это будет главная цель визита. Потом я думаю, что мы поедем куда-то в Аутбэк, вдоль голубых гор сзади, и насладимся настоящей Австралией. Отдохнем от западного Сиднея. Alright, guys, please explain what's going on, why you're here, because probably we will be here too very soon.
Yeah, we're from the Maritime Union of Australia. We're here protesting the Turnbull's government issuing the temporary licences for vessels to carry cargo around the Australian coast, which should be carried by Australian seafarers on Australian vessels.
I clearly understand you, and do you think that they would help or they would listen to you? What's your opinion? What do you think?
Yeah, we're going to do everything possible we can within the boundaries of the law to make them listen. And we will be here until we can get some answers or we can get some action from the government.
Thank you for your coming. Thank you for your talk. And what would you like to tell Russian students, Russian people in Russia?
MUA, here to stay.
Thank you very much. Beautiful.
Thank you.
Это парламентский дом. Сейчас вот будет экскурсия. Здесь вот замечательные люди. Здесь и охрана есть. А там снаружи стоят автоматчики. Так. Где же у нас? Повернуть картинку. Сейчас картинку повернем. Вот такое маленькое селфи из парламентского хауса. Где-то 45 минут будет, в общем-то, экскурсия проводиться. Парламент сейчас, слава богу, под хорошей охраной. Скажем так, мы не траблмейкеры, но может такое случиться, что кто-то и как бы, со злыми намерениями. Такое неплохое здание в стиле модерн. Вот. И через 45 минут забираем машину из карпарка и уезжаем. Спасибо. Вот начинаем экскурсию. Ребята из Арканзаса сзади, американцы, спереди тоже какие-то туристы. Но мы вроде свои. Вот люди тоже на экскурсию пришли. Здесь сейчас у нас садится народ. Вот. Что-то русских напоминают.
Okay, my name is Ian Dobson. Welcome to Parliament House. As we go about, feel free to take photographs. No real problem with that. I will point out a few displays before that. I will point out a few displays that we won't have time to have a look at. You might like to look at later. And what I will do before we start moving through the building, I'll give you some background information that will help you understand what this is all about. This is our Federal Parliament House. In Australia, we federated on the 1st of January 1901, just over 116 years ago. Previous to that time, 6 Australian states, they had their own parliaments, they were making their own laws, they started to act like separate countries. Victoria had different money to New South Wales, they had their own army, their own navy, travelling between Sydney and Melbourne, you stopped at the border, you paid taxes on goods that you were taking between the states. So they decided it would be good to federate. Now when we federated, it's interesting to note that both New Zealand and Fiji were involved in the discussions as well. So I think of the rugby team we could have had. I don't know about cricket, there's a few little issues. But when we federated there was a big problem, and the problem was if you have a federal parliament where one member represents the same number of people, the problem is that most of the people in Australia live in the southeastern corner. Though that parliament would be dominated by New South Wales and Victoria. And at first the other states not that keen on this idea of forming Australia. So those people who wanted it to happen, if you want to just go past and say, looked at another country where the states had come together, the United States of America had exactly the same problem. And in their parliament, which they call the Congress in America, they said they'd have 2 parts. One part where each member represents the same number of people, that's referred to as the House of Representatives, and another part where each state has the same number of senators regardless of its population. So the concept of a House of Representatives and a Senate we got from the Americans. When we federated, there's no money for capital cities or anything like that. In fact, the Constitution had written into it that our first federal parliament would use the Victorian parliamentary buildings, so our parliament would sit down there. It did say that that would be a temporary arrangement, and it did say that the federal capital would be in New South Wales, but no closer than 100 miles to Sydney. So when the parliament was sitting down in Melbourne, in 1908, they established the ACT region here, where the federal capital would be. And in 1911, they organised a competition to plan this city, Canberra. That competition was won by a Chicago architect. His name was Walter Burley Griffin. And if you go to the top of the building, and if you look to the north, you'll see some of the main features of Walter Burley Griffin's plan. There is a land axis that goes through the top of Mount Ainslie, through the top of this hill. And it is on that land line or axis the monumental buildings of the nation were to be built. You'll see the War Memorial the other side, the Parliament House this side. And perpendicular to that land axis is a water axis. Lake Burley Griffin. That's an artificial lake. It filled up in the 1960s. And when Walter Burley Griffin was talking about Canberra and its buildings, he stated a very important concept for our federal parliament. He said, if we Australians wanted to consider, they opened the old Parliament House, the white building we see down the hill there. That was built as a temporary Parliament House. It was quite small when it opened in 1927. They did 3 major additions to it. By the mid-1970s, there were issues with its operation, so they commenced the process to build this permanent Parliament House. And once again, to go about that, they organised a competition to design this building. There were lots of entries into that competition. In fact, there were 329 of them, which is a lot for an architectural competition. But there was one entry by an architectural firm whose name was Mitchell, Jurgler and Thorpe, which was the unanimous decision of the judges of that competition. And it's interesting to note that the principal design architect of that winning team, his name was Romaldo Jurgler. He was an Italian who was lecturing in America at the time. He was originally chosen to be one of the judges of that competition. But when he read the brief, he just said it's such a great concept, he wanted to be an entrant. It was also interesting to note that when the building was opened and completed, and that was in May 1988 that they started to use this building, Romaldo Jurgler did not go back to Italy, nor America. He stayed in the Canberra region. He knows where the best place in the world to live is. Why his plan was chosen, it fits very well into Walter Burley Griffin's plan. In fact, that land access I was talking about goes right through the centre of the building. And you could open all of those doorways and you could look right through the building. They don't do it very often, it goes right through the Prime Minister's office, but you could. And the building is symmetrical around that land access. There are two very large curved walls. Outside the curved walls on this side of the building is the House of Representatives side of the building, and on this side is the Senate side. And where we are today is the public area and what is referred to as the ministerial area behind us. When they started to build this building, it was a hill. Had a few grasses and trees and shrubs on it. They blasted down 21 metres and they removed the rock and material, stored it on the side, and as they built the building they put about 80% of that material back around the building. So the building is not actually built on top of the hill, it is built into the hill. And when you came towards it, you may have noticed the grass ramps that go up over the building. When it did open in 1988, they were open public access areas. You could run off the road, walk your dog over the top of Parliament House, ride a bike across. In today's world, for obvious reasons, they have restricted the ability of vehicles being able to get from the road to the top. They have put barriers up, but you people, you can come in, you can take a lift to the top of the building, and you can have your photograph taken jumping up and down on your Parliament House if you wish. So the concept that the people are above the Parliament is there. And I should say, we Australians are extremely proud, as we should be, of the openness of our federal parliamentary building. The areas that you go to today when Parliament is sitting, no other parliament would have the access that we have in Australia. Let's hope it remains that way. Now the building, as well as being a functional Parliament House, it is a symbolic building. It tells us, about our history, particularly concerning our interactions with the land. And if you walk through the centre of the building, you walk through areas that are designed to tell us that history. Outside in the forecourt, when you came to the building, red, brown, gravelly, dry, treeless. That's most of Australia. You may have noticed the water feature, and in the water feature there's an island, and on the island there is a patina stone, a mosaic that's based upon an Aboriginal painting. And if you have a look at it, it's a series of circles with tracks leading towards it, which means a watering hole, a meeting place, or in a sense the first parliaments of Australia go back many thousands of years. We recognise Aboriginal people have been living here for at least 50,000 years. When Europeans came to this part of the world, just under 200 years ago, there were a group of people living here called the Ngunnawal people. The next area you walk into there is the marble foyer with a beautiful marble staircase, marble columns. What's all that about? The grand buildings in ancient Rome and Athens. That represents the time that Europeans came to this part of the world and discovered Australia. When those early European explorers came here, Captain Cook, Abel Tasman, William Dampier, those people, they were in ships. They sailed along the coastal areas. And when they looked back at the land, they saw lots of trees, lots of forested areas. In fact, their early descriptions of Australia were that it was a land of great forests. So in there you'll notice 48 columns covered in the green brown marble. They symbolise those forested areas that those early explorers saw. And the black limestone is the shade. Up on the walls, the beautiful images of plants in wood. The plants on the northern wall, they're market brick panels. The plants, though, are plants important to Aboriginal people. They're foods, they're medicinal plants. The plants on the southern wall, probably more familiar to most of us Australians, the banksias, the waratahs, the bottle brushes, they are the plants that Sir Joseph Banks, who was a botanist with Captain Cook, drew in his journal when he first visited Australia there in 1770. Continuing along that landline, you come into this room, the Great Hall, the largest of the 4,500 rooms within the building. So it is a big building. The yellow skylight, the red-brown jarrah timber floor, the sun and the soil. This represents the time of settlement in Australia. Europeans couldn't survive here at first. They brought all the crops out, didn't grow. A person called William Farrer developed a type of wheat that could grow in a hotter, drier climate. That was a very important process for Australia. The wool industry, which is certainly a lot of sheep around this part of the world. Very important, our first major export industry. But we know there are hardships dealing with the land, the droughts, the flooding rains, the bushfires, the isolation. And over on the side wall is a beautiful embroidery panel that shows you the way we are has been determined by those interactions with the land. On the far wall here, the great tapestry, woven like a carpet, a beautiful art. The architects wanted you to walk below a scene which depicted the Australian environment. They approached a prominent Australian artist, Arthur Boyd. he suggested the idea that he could do a series of paintings, they could blow it up to make that much larger tapestry. And that's how they did proceed. A magnificent effort. Victorian Tapestry Association, 13 of them, about 2.5 years to weave. It was woven vertically so it would fit close to the wall. There are some interesting features. If you go to the centre, and if you go towards the ceiling, and you'll have a little bit of a trouble, but you can imagine it for a while, you'll see there is one animal. It's behind a tree. It has its wings spread out. It's a white bird, a sulphur-crested cockatoo with a big yellow bit on top. A common bird around Australia. We have plenty of them in Canberra here, and they love plum trees, particularly my plum tree. To the left of that bird, you'll see another interesting feature. A red trunk tree about 2 metres across, at a height slightly higher than the bird. There appears to be a flame or a teardrop in the sky. That is not in the painting. Why did they include it? The tradition of grand tapestries is that you date them when they're made, like all artworks, but you don't put the numerical date. You put some astronomical event, something that occurs in the heavens. For those of us who can remember back to 1986, Halley's Comet was the big event. I should say this room's used for ceremonial occasions. It's available for public hire. It's a functions room. We've had wedding receptions here. Okay, gather your belongings together and we will start moving through the building.
Картина.
Don't touch, please. This is obviously the painting which is the basis for the weaving of that much large tapestry. The artist Arthur Boyd had a studio on the Shoalhaven River, just over the coastal areas, just down from Sydney. This is a very good interpretation of an Australian forest scene. Why? It's not the lush greens of the European North American forest. This is the dry Australia. But with the wide use of pastel colours, it's certainly not a dead forest. That cycle of growth, death and decay. The effects of bushfires, always evident in our forest scene. The very bright blue sky, characteristic of Australian scenery. This is where that comet is. You'll notice there is nothing there. That is that bird. And when you think about it, this is a magnificent painting for what it was to achieve. Because I'm sure if you'd gone to most artists and said, paint us a description of Australia, they would have given us the big panoramic view, the hills, the mountains, the clouds and all of that stuff. This artist, Arthur Boyd, gives us a very specific view, a great feeling of what Australia's like. But of course, how does he create the feeling of the vastness of Australia? Something you would want to get across if you were going to paint it. You'll notice in most of that painting there is no horizon, and that forest goes on and on. That's the feeling you get. Magnificent. Let's move on. There you go, mate. You can join on. No, you're all right. We all have our little screens. For the observant ones amongst us, you will realise this is the basis for that mosaic out the front. An Aboriginal artist, Michael Nelson Jacamara, there was a competition. We have quite a deal of Aboriginal art within the building. Why? Because it's very important to them. It is their written language. That is, these paintings are their Bibles, their history books. This is how they transmit their culture from one generation to the next. And of course, Aboriginal people are very diverse. Those in the coastal areas and down in Tasmania are different from these people in the Western Desert of the Northern Territory. They used to do their paintings in sand, using sand colours and dots and stuff like that, to tell their stories. In the 1970s they said put acrylic dots on art like this. So this is only a recent art movement, it hasn't been with us for a long period of time. It's interesting, one of these artists that submitted into this competition, Clifford Possum, actually sold artwork, not unsimilar to this type of stuff, in America for $4 million American dollars. It is a significant art process, very difficult to do too if you ever try to do it. Let's move on. Just come up here, both, and we'll... We'll stop here. If we could just move back so that if anybody's moving through the building they can go along there without tripping over us all. I'll tell you about this one. You might like to look at it later. It is a magnificent display. We follow British traditions. They go back a long way. 800 years ago in Britain the people were ruled by a process called divine right. They believed somebody up there put the kings or queens down here and it was absolute power. What they said, you did. In 1215 there was an English king. His name was King John I. Like most English kings of that particular time, he was having a little war with France. But he wasn't very good at it. He wanted to get better. He needed a bigger army. A bigger army meant that those people who paid the taxes in those days, the rich landowners, started to rebel against that extra taxation. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? When the king heard of this little rebellion and what they were doing, he decided he'd better make peace with the barons, so he decided he would sit down with them and draw up a list of rules, what they could do and what he could do. That was referred to as the Magna Carta. They're all happy, they went away, and then of course the king said, load of rubbish, I was forced to do it. The only problem is he didn't live much longer. He only lived a year. His son became the king, but stayed in the family. He was only 9 years old, Henry III. The barons had a bit of power, so they sat down with him and said, let's write out a few copies so we don't forget what it is all about, which they did. Henry III didn't follow it, but his son, who was Edward I in 1297, had a little different problem. The Scots in northern Britain there had started to rebel against the rule of the kings and queens from the south. You may have heard of a person called William Wallace. Brave Mel Gibson. We all know who we're talking about now. You know, that guy, that was the time. So the king needed all the people on side. He needed to have this army so he could defeat the Scots who were starting to cause those problems. He decided he would get the Magna Carta written out and say, this is officially how we're going to work. He got copies made to be sent around to be read out every 6 months. That is one of those copies, dating from 1297, a magnificent document. How did it come to Australia? This was the copy that went south. They thought it had been lost hundreds of years ago. But in the 1930s, in a very old English school building, a person was cleaning out papers that gather in the bottom of those buildings. He discovered it. Yes, it was a Magna Carta. The school is running short of money in the 1950s. They decided they would auction it to the highest bidder. Problem? The Americans had all the money. They were buying all of this stuff. We'll auction it to the highest bidder in a Commonwealth country. Somebody here in Australia, 12,500 English pounds, we got it. Here it is. The Americans bought a copy off a private owner not so long ago. They paid 24 million American dollars. So it's a copy of that vintage, but it's nowhere near as good as that. That little document there is worth pricelessly. That is why there is a little thing there that says no flash photography. Please observe that. Habeas corpus is one of the things that is in there. You are innocent in our judicial system until you are proven guilty. Still applies today. Julian Assange in England. Magna Carta. Okay, let's move on.
Сейчас идем уже в другое крыло.
Yeah, there's 19 of them. Beautiful views of natural light. They are suspended courtyards actually because there's still a bit of on the Okay, this area here, this is the members' hall, large open area in the centre of the building. It is the architectural, ceremonial, symbolic centre of the building. Above us here, if you look at that reflective pool, you see that star from our flag. It's always reflected from whichever side you are on. That's the 7-pointed star from our flag, 6 points representing each of the states, 1 the territories. When the members and the senators are gathered down there and look into that reflective pool, they see reflected the one symbol of the Australian people that goes above us. The large flag, almost the size of a tennis court, 81 metres high. And I suggest that if you have time, you go up to the top of the building. That is the lift over there on the there that'll take you up there. Good panoramic views. On that little timeline, remember I said Aboriginal people, Europeans discovered it, they settled it. This represents the now of the building. It's starting, now, 12 o'clock, the House of Representatives. So this is the now of the building, and that's the axis of the parliamentary administration. This part of the building behind us here is the future. Who is determining our future? The Prime Minister and his ministers. That's referred to as the ministerial section of the building. As you go throughout the building, you'll see high quality materials. Beautiful Australian marble on the front of the building. Beautiful Australian timbers. I will say, not Australian marble, beautiful European marbles. The granite is the Australian stuff here. The building is designed to last 200 years. These floors stick a layer of packets on them than you would normally be accustomed to. You'll notice they are being damaged with modern footwear. We hope that when they need to renovate that, they will just take the surface layer off. The plaster in these areas, this white plaster represents the early tents. When the colonies, when people came from Europe, their first accommodation were white tents that they brought, canvas tents. You'll notice that it's not just plaster, it's plaster with very small chips of marble in it. That is an interesting process that the Italian architect knew about. It was called stucco lustro. Where he came from, in Italy, they built cathedrals, plaster ceilings. They sent those Renaissance artists up, Michelangelo, and they painted the frescoes. Beautiful. They've lasted in a magnificent condition because they use this stucco lustro process. When they mix the plaster up, they keep it quite moist. They sprinkle a bit of marble dust on it, spread it, and that marble dust immediately interacts with the carbon dioxide, recrystallises into a microscopic thin layer on the outside. You'll see it's a little bit shiny, a bit different to normal plaster. It doesn't allow any moisture to move through it, so the inside of the plaster always remains slightly moist. So when the building moves also slightly, the plaster doesn't crack. Renaissance Italians realised that 400 years ago. I wish the person who built my house 40 years ago knew about it. Okay, now the House of Representatives is sitting at the moment. Normally when our Parliament is sitting, most times we have the two houses working together. But for 2 times a year, the Senate likes to review how the government's spending the money. So in our Parliament at the moment, there is only one house that will be sitting from 12 o'clock. That is the House of Representatives. Now to go into Parliament, there is a condition that you cannot take any recording devices in, mobile phones, cameras or anything like that, or bags or stuff that you can throw at them, right? Don't say that. So if you want to go in, you cloak those in that little cloaking room over there. Now, what I will do, we can go in and sit in a Senate chamber, and I will explain what happens in the House of Representatives over there. So let's move over to the Senate.
Что-то мне сказали. Это очень хороший пластер. Джеброк с мрамором. Очень хорошее качество. Ну что, в Сенат идем? Отдыхает народ правящий. Охранники коричневые, как и в Сиднее. О, вот оно как выглядит. Класс.
А там королева, не хочешь кого-нибудь сфотографировать?
Где?
Ну, там.
Структура?
Нет, портрет.
Вон парламентский дом. Вон там. Лори сидит. Ну и где они сидят. Сейчас мы туда войдем. Ты видела материал стен?
Материал.
Нет. Это гипсокартон, покрытый крошкой мраморной. И когда она застывает, она делается в виде пленки. Итальянский рецепт. И он всегда сыровой, он никогда не лопается.
О, это другое дело. Ну, ты иди ближе к нему.
Okay, now normally we'd do this in reverse, so we'd be in the green one over there. Now if you close your eyes and use your imagination, just think of the chamber. It looks a little bit like this, but it's green over there. It's the House of Representatives. So I'll describe that first, how that works over there. Australia is divided up into 150 areas. Each of those areas has about the same number of people in it. Each of those areas is called a federal electorate. And we have a census where they count where the people are every 6 to 7 years, and they use that to draw up these federal electorates. Each federal electorate votes a member to represent them for a maximum of 3 years. And for those not familiar with Australia, voting is compulsory for all people over 18. After a federal election, when they are electing a new House of Representatives, after that, the group who can win the vote in the House of Representatives forms the government. You need 76 or more to vote the same on most issues. They don't have to vote on everything the same, but the big issues regarding how they collect the money, how they spend it, and confidence, 76 or more. We have a government at the moment that is not one political party, it is two, it is referred to as a coalition. And it's important to appreciate that there are members of Parliament called independents. They certainly don't, you don't have to belong to a political party, and it's not a party political thing that you have to be to form a government. Why I say that, a lot of Australians believe that it is either this big group or this big group. It is either the government or the opposition. And I feel because we tend to vote along the lines thinking it's either them or them, that we are losing a little bit of confidence in our Parliament representing us. Because there is one extremely important principle that I think we should get back to. When we vote for the person who we think will best represent our electorate. They may be a member of a big political party, a small political party, or they may be an independent. That is important. Now, if you have a look at our parliamentary chamber and the House of Representatives is the same, it is a U shape because from the British we got the idea of having parliamentary chambers which are debating chambers. That is, they are organised arguing chambers. Vigorous argument is the sign that it is working effectively. They don't argue on all of the issues, they agree on quite a few. But the big arguments going on regarding what our health systems, what our education systems, how are we going to pay for them, those policy debates are how it works. A lot of this part of the parliamentary process, this little part behind us, that's the press gallery, they concentrate on personalities of the people these days, not on their policy. The personality of our parliamentarians is not going to be the thing that will determine our future. It is the policies that they develop, the arguments that they put up for those policies, and that is the important outcomes of Parliament. When they meet on the first time, they appoint people to sit in the large chair out the front, or the small chair, but the chair out the front there. When you go into the House of Representatives, that person is called the Speaker. And the government always sits on the right-hand side of the Speaker and the opposition on the left-hand side. The person who sits in the chair here is not called the Speaker, they're called the President. And the government senators sit one side, the opposition senators the other side. Now, in Australia, our members in the House of Representatives and our senators, they represent the people of the states and their electorates, but the government performs another very important function. They administer directly the major government departments. And they do that by appointing one member from their side to represent to be the chief administrator of that government department. They determine what happens in them, they are accountable for what happens in them, and they represent them in Parliament. We call those members of Parliament the ministers. So we have the Minister for Health, the Minister for Education, the Treasurer. And in the House of Representatives, they have a bench in the front for them. They are the front benches. In here, the ministers sit back in the chairs in the front. They don't have a separate front bench in the Senate. Now, one member of the government is chosen by the government to be their leader. We refer to that person as our Prime Minister. And when you look in the House of Representatives, you'll see two boxes on the table that look a little like treasure chests. They are referred to as the dispatch box. Next to the dispatch box on the right-hand side of the Speaker is where Malcolm Turnbull, our Prime Minister, sits. And across the table, looking at him, ready to argue the issues, is where the Leader of the Opposition sits. And there's one crucial point of Australia that we need to remember. We do not elect Prime Ministers. Our Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, he was elected as a Member of Parliament to represent an electorate, like the other 150 members there. The governing group then get together and say, look, you be our leader. That's why they refer to him as the Prime Minister. And certainly, in Australia, if governments lose confidence in their leader, they change. So they should. Why I say that is because in Australia, just recently, we have had a few Prime Ministers come and go because the government decided they felt that they could do better with something. That I've heard referred to as something very poor for Australia. I've heard that it cost us a lot of money. It didn't cost us anything. They just changed, Prime Minister wrote out Malcolm Turnbull, put somebody else up. We don't elect directly Prime Ministers. And I think it's a good thing if there is a governing team that loses confidence in its leader, that they certainly should change that. They shouldn't have a leader that they are not confident with. That's important for us. This Parliament tells us a little bit about the way we are. We have these open gallery areas. In fact, in this House of Representatives, 550 seats. We have a very open Parliament. The press gallery, a very important part of our parliamentary system. In front of Parliament House, between here and Old Parliament House, is actually an area designed so people can protest, demonstrate. Now, when you go into the House of Representatives, and it happens here, the first thing a new member or a senator, they go to the front bench, they declare an oath to the Parliament. They put their hand on a religious book and raise their right hand. I'm going to work hard, tell the truth. The religious books they choose, a Bible. If they're Christian, they could choose that. If they're Jewish, a Torah or an Old Testament. If they're Muslim, there's a Quran. If they're a Buddhist, there's a Buddhist Book of Rights, a beautiful book, decorated book. Because there is one very important point about Australia. We have what's called tolerance of religion. Our Parliament does not support or inhibit any religious belief. We believe religious tolerance is a very important part of the way we are and hope will be into the future. Now, when you go across, if you go across to the House of Representatives, they are starting in about another 20 minutes' time, and what they will do at 12 o'clock, they'll all file in there, and they will say a prayer. As they do it. That is not a religious introduction. Because although our Parliament doesn't support or inhibit religion, we certainly are a spiritual Parliament. That is, we believe maybe there's somebody there, or somebody who made us all and did all that stuff. Who it is, or what it is, or how you worship it, that depends upon you. So they decided they would have a spiritual introduction to the Parliament. They decided they would have a parliamentary prayer. They had a little committee. They weren't getting very far until somebody said, the Lord's Prayer, why don't we use that? It doesn't identify a religion. It's applicable to quite a few of the religions of the world, particularly those that follow Abraham. So they will say the Lord's Prayer, not as a Christian introduction to the Parliament, but a spiritual introduction to the Parliament. There is a difference there, and that's important to us. Okay, in the Senate here, why do we have a Senate? There's 150 in the House of Representatives. Of those 150, 48 of them come from New South Wales, 37 from Victoria, 5 from Tasmania. So from the Americans, we got the idea of this Senate, and in here, each Australian state has 12 senators, regardless of their population. So a big state like New South Wales has 12, a small state like Tasmania has 12. And those 12 senators sit for a fixed period of 6 years. But every 3 years, on a rotational basis, half of those senators retire for re-election. So every 3 years in Australia, each Australian state will be voting for 6 state senators. Not all of their senators, but only half of them every 3 years. And I should say the two large territories population-wise, the ACT and the Northern Territory, they started down the process of self-government in the 1970s. They were granted 2 senators as well. So the number of senators is 76. To be elected, quite a different process. Because we are usually voting for a House of Representatives every 3 years, we usually have the elections together. Usually we are voting for a member to represent our electorate, and we get another piece of paper, usually when we vote in Australia, which is for half our senators. To be a member, to represent an electorate in the House of Representatives, you need to beat everybody else who wants to win that vote. You have to gain over 50% of the vote. If you've got more than half, nobody can have more than you. When we vote in Australia, we vote preferentially. We listed our candidates, and we say we want this person first, second, third, fourth. The first part of the count is they put all the piles of ones out. And if there's no pile of ones that is over 50%, nobody has an absolute majority. So they go to the smallest pile of ones. They're not real popular. They redistribute their second preference. So they keep eliminating the smaller piles until one of the big piles is over 50%. Preferential voting. Why do we have it? It's important. I'll explain why. If you had an electorate, there were 10 candidates, and they were all as popular as each other. If you just counted the one vote, you'll probably have one of those getting ahead with just over 10% of the vote. And under those circumstances, the question is, what did almost the other 90% think about this one person? So that you get the best candidate to represent an electorate, preferential voting is extremely important. In the Senate, they use preferential voting, but the figures are a little different. There are 6 state senators that you are voting for. So to be a state senator, you don't need half the vote, you only need a sixth of the vote, which is certainly a lot less. We have a political party, the Greens, we say they're minor. Minor in the sense that they're getting about 1 in 5 votes. That is, they can make the 20%. They find it difficult to get elected to the House of Representatives, those smaller minor groups. There is one Greens member there. It's not impossible to do it, but you have to be pretty good to get there. In the Senate, if you are a political party and you are getting 1 in 5 votes, and you only need 1 in 6 votes to be a senator, you will be represented. There are 10 Green senators here. So this is the chamber where the small or minor parties are represented in our democracy. And that is certainly very important. The laws of the land, we call them bills when they are being debated and discussed in Parliament. They can start in either chamber. In fact, 10% of them start here. There are ministers here, heads of government departments. But certainly, most of the bills start in the House of Representatives. Those bills have to be agreed upon by both houses of Parliament. Who always wins the vote in the House of Representatives? The government. That's how we define who the government is. Will the government always win the vote in the Senate? The answer to that question is, it's unlikely that the government know that they will win that vote, because there are those minor groups. It's a different structure to the House of Representatives. So the Senate is seen as a house of review, a house of scrutiny as to what the government is putting through Parliament. Our coat of arms over there, the emu and the kangaroo, they are looking across the chamber, reviewing what goes on. The Senate generally tries to pass what the government wants to put through Parliament. They put small amendments on it. If they are happy and they are happy, everybody's happy. But occasionally the Senate says no to a major bill that the government want to put through Parliament. The bill will be sent back to the government. They can wait a period of 3 months and try again with exactly the same bill. If the bill is rejected again after the 3-month period, it is sent back to the government, and we have what is called a trigger for a double dissolution election. If the government in the House of Representatives thinks this bill is an important bill, if they think the people of Australia think it's an important bill, they can say, look, Parliament is not working for us. We, the government, are having our legislation blocked by the Senate. Dissolve all of the Parliament and we'd have an election for an entirely new Parliament. It is an election that we would refer to in Australia as a double dissolution election. We would be voting for all of the House of Representatives, as we normally do. And we would be voting for all of our state senators, not half of them, but the whole 12 of them. So to be a state senator when there's a double dissolution election, you wouldn't need a sixth of the vote, you need a 12th of the vote, which is quite a small percentage, less than 8% of the state people voting for it. Right? It's still a whack of votes, but it's just a smaller percentage of the people voting for it. So do governments go down that path? Very often. They would have to be extremely popular. We've only had 6 double dissolution elections in 100 years. The last one we had was 1987. So it's not what you'd say, a very common event. 1974, there was an interesting bill that went through Parliament. It was a universal healthcare bill where they increased the taxes by about 1% extra taxation. We got a little card called the Medibank card. It is now that green card we call the Medicare card in Australia. When we go to the doctors, they put it through a machine and we don't pay the amount that they're asking. Right? Universal health care, they thought it was very important that all Australians should be able to have good health regardless of their ability to pay for it. I think most people would say that's a pretty admirable quality of a democracy. The Senate said no twice. The government went to the people. They won the election fairly well in the House of Representatives. The bill went through there. Through the Senate. There was a very small number, I think it was 1 or 2, who didn't vote for it. If that happens, the government can order a joint sitting of Parliament. They can say, look, we've won the election fairly well in the House of Representatives, but that Senate is still blocking us. So they can order a joint sitting of Parliament. And when there's a joint sitting of Parliament, all of the senators go over and sit in the House of Representatives as one large body and vote on it. There's 150 in the House of Representatives. The Senate, where there is 76, has to be about half the size of it. You'll never get the Senate being more than half the size of the House of Representatives. It works very well for us. It's not perfect. In the large chair below the coat of arms, a very important person sits. The person on all of our currency, our head of state, Queen Elizabeth II. The English king or queen is our Australian head of state. Every bill, every action that passes through Parliament has to get the king or queen's approval. In Australia, the monarchy is represented by our Governor-General. And Sir Peter Cosgrove, the Government House, you can see it, it's just over the back there, about 5 minutes drive away from here. Of course, every action goes out there and gets that seal of approval. The Governor-General generally takes the advice of the Prime Minister, but doesn't have to.